Maybe as a start, what's the definition of an RFP? What's an RFP?
Yes, so an RFP, it stands for if you're entering into a new market. Another good way of doing an RFP is to go out to banks that you'd like to partner with, effectively get their list of capabilities, pricing, solutions.
What are my key criteria when I reach out to the banks, and how can I formulate that when I'm reaching out to them?
They can be used in a number of different ways.
How does the team look like for you to be able to go for an RFP?
How the landscape can change between, doing it say 10 years ago to doing it a year ago. Back in the day, a lot of manual payments, checks. Now you've got mobile money. Now we're looking at stable coin. All of these things are now coming through.
Yeah. Some banks would provide really good pricing. But for you, you want it to be fair, so you chose the cheaper one. And then 1 year down the road, you realize you did a big mistake. How can we try to avoid that?
Yeah, so
mitigate that.
For me, pricing.
It's great to have you again.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Welcome again. Last season we had you on the treasury transformation, and it was one of the best performing episodes that we had. So just for the people who haven't watched the episode, I'm going to put a link to it, but just for them, maybe a brief intro about your journey and who you are, just so we can start the episode.
Yeah, so thanks for having me back. It's an absolute pleasure. So my name's Roshun. I've been working in treasury for about 16 years now. I've been in the region for 11. Worked for companies such as Burberry, Reckitt, Mantrack, and I'm now Deputy Treasurer at Agility.
So today we're going to discuss specifically RFPs and specifically banking RFPs. So maybe as a start, what's the definition of an RFP? What's an RFP?
Yes, so an RFP, it stands for Request for Proposal.
Okay.
And they're typically used by organisations for requesting banking services, solutions. So very, very commonly used by corporates.
Okay, then me as a treasury department or as a corporate, maybe I'm working with banks. Maybe I'm starting from scratch. I'm going to... It makes sense. If I don't have any banks, then I do an RFP. Or maybe I'm working already with banks. When would I need an RFP? If I already have my portfolio of banks, or I'm working with one bank or two banks, or if I'm going to start from scratch, do I just go with the first bank that I see in front of me, or is there a specific thing that will let me know, okay, this is the time that you need to go for an RFP? How do I know that?
Yes, RFPs, they can be used in a number of cases. So what you've just highlighted are some of the examples. So, where I've commonly used RFPs and kind of where I really started doing bank RFPs was at the end of a refinancing. Okay, so it could be that you're raising debt, you've got a new banking group, and there's a way of sharing ancillary business around. Okay, so that could be one option where you've got a number of banks that are requiring ancillary and you're effectively offering that. So you'd go out to the banks, you'd understand their footprint, their capabilities, and you could actually do a formal RFP across your sort of network, country network within a corporate.
Okay.
You've got other more, I would say, solution-led RFPs. So for example, if you're looking to roll out a supply chain financing program, for example, you could reach out to your relationship banks and request for their capabilities within supply chain financing, understand their pricing. So that's another example of an RFP. So they can be used in a number of different ways. If you're entering into a new market, you've not got any banks there, another good way of doing an RFP is to effectively go out to banks that you'd like to partner with and effectively get their list of capabilities, pricing, solutions. So they can be used in a number of use cases.
So if for the major one that we want to discuss, it's not about a specific project. So for the example that you mentioned, the supply chain financing, let's put that to the side now. We want to discuss if I'm going full-fledged, full services, ancillary business, cash management, and all of this stuff. I want to start having an RFP for banks that are providing all the banking capabilities, maybe some bilateral facilities, overdrafts, working capital facilities, all of that. When I'm approaching banks for this, what are my key criteria when I reach out to the banks, and how can I formulate that when I'm reaching out to them?
Yeah, so I think a lot of your prerequisites for an RFP are actually what your business needs. Okay, so a treasury department, ultimately, we are a business partner. Okay, so we are supporting the business, supporting their growth, supporting their solutions on the ground. So my first point of call would always be to understand the business that you have in each market. So for example, if your particular business is very cash focused, cash collections, check collections, you wouldn't want a bank that has one branch in a city that only has digital capabilities, right? So a lot of the prerequisites are really fact finding what you want from your business. Okay, so you've got solution driven aspects, that you want from your business. You've also got your general capabilities around, can they offer trade solutions? Can they do government payments, payroll services? All of these things are questions that need to be asked when you're doing an RFP. So I would always start with having a list of needs and wants, and these can be things that the business requires for its day-to-day management. There's going to be things that Treasury require. So, when I've looked at RFPs before, I've always looked to ask questions that will help future-proof Treasury and the business. So, for example, I will ask banks around their digital capabilities, security, integration with other systems, all of these important things that you need to ask a bank that can aid your decision making. So that's always where I would start. You need to be very, very clear around what you need as a business, what you need as a treasury. And then effectively, the way that I would put an RFP together would, be a list of questions that I've got for the banks. I would often provide, and this is if you've got a business that's already set up, you can provide volume data, transaction amounts, they can
From the
help with the
historical
pricing.
data that you have.
Yeah, exactly. If you don't have that and you're entering into a new market, for example, forecast data, these sort of things are very, very helpful because it allows the banks to assess, what the business is like, from a structure perspective,
And
and the sort of
hence their
flows going through.
potential profitability, and then they will
Absolutely.
be able to accordingly provide you the sensible costs for that or fees to cover
Absolutely.
their profitability,
Absolutely.
correct?
And then the final part is really, as you mentioned, your sort of other ancillary business. So do you need uncommitted lines? Do you need trade facilities? Do you need committed facilities in those markets? So that can all be part of your request. FX, if you want to agree fixed spreads, all of these things can be added into your request.
So this is the prerequisites from identifying what you need from the banks as per the business needs. Now, if we look at the prerequisites from the team, what sorts of structure or how does the team look like for you to be able to go for an RFP? So let me just give an example. I would imagine that if you have a small team of one member, maybe let's say one senior analyst reporting to you, I would imagine if also given the exposure of the business, if you're operating in 10 countries, it would be very tricky to do an RFP just two people. So maybe I'm mistaken, but let's try to define what's the requirement if you're doing an RFP, let's say at a decent scale.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it largely depends on what stage of the RFP you're at. So I think when you're initially going out and requesting information from a bank, that could potentially be done by one person, right? I think once you've had those discussions internally, you've reached out to the business, you've understood your needs, that sort of relationship between the banks, asking for the information, answering any questions that the bank may have and what you've needed, that potentially could be done by one person. It's when the implementation sort of happens, that's when you ideally need people on the ground. That's when you need to leverage the business that's there. When you get to the point, and I know we're skipping ahead a little bit, but once you've made a decision and you actually need to go and implement, people doing the account openings, actually going out and filling in documentation, all of these things, you typically need a little bit more support if it's not done at head office already.
So if we can define, if we can, fine, if we cannot, the different roles that you would have in this team. So who will be doing what? Let's say you define, okay, we need, for example, 3 people. This person will be doing that, this person will be doing this, and then the treasurer or the head of treasury will be involved in these parts of the RFP. Can we define that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've got quite a few roles within Treasury. I mean, I probably won't be specific to each person, but I think in terms of the roles you need, so within a sort of fact finding or RFP, you can have certain solutions which typically sit in the back office function a little bit more. So I would say things around, gathering the payment volumes, gathering the transaction data, generally could be performed by back office, or if it's something that you'd get from your local management team in country, getting that data. So you may have it readily available from a TMS, you may need to get it from an ERP, but getting that data is quite an important thing. When you look at, and again, staying on the back office sort of role, the capabilities around what the banks can offer, you need someone to assess that, okay? Because what you'll find is when you start getting 40-page documents about all the wonderful things a bank can do, you do need someone to read that and understand it, right? Actually getting into the detail around what the bank is saying. So being able to assess how to integrate one bank with a system, for example, how to assess whether or not a bank can service all government payments in the country. These sort of things, you need someone close to the operations in order to really truly understand that. Because I've seen examples where a bank has said, yes, we can make all government payments. When you actually read in, sometimes it's through a separate portal. Sometimes it can take 3 days to clear. All of these specifics are sort of, just as an example, things that need to be, looked into. So that can be someone from a back office perspective, that could being someone in country. You've then got roles around, understanding the facilities that you need. So, potentially if your business is very involved in trade finance, understanding the instruments that might be required locally, and understanding the bank's capabilities around that. So somebody who's very, used to dealing with the trade terms, understanding things around the trade pricing is very important, because you have many elements of the pricing that comes in as well. So it's really around that. You kind of want your experience to be tailored to kind of the certain things that you're asking for. So that kind of gives an example. And then when you're looking at implementation, depending on how thorough the implementation is, you may then need IT support. You may need legal support to review documentation with the banks. So you then start to see, once you're at the decision making, at the evaluation of each of the banks, you then need to kind of bring in other departments to kind of help with that. And it can get even more complex, right? So if you're asking a bank to understand like pooling structures or sweeping, you may need to involve your tax team in order to understand the regulatory aspects around it. So I would say, when you're entering into an RFP, having that internal stakeholder management is very important, just because you are going to need to reach out to people for advice. Decision making around these RFPs as well is very, very critical. So there's a number of roles involved, and I think the treasurer's role or head of treasury's role is kind of bringing all of that together, and ensuring that to make the right decision, all of the information's come in, and treasury is all about data in a sense, right, and bringing that knowledge in order to make the decision.
One of the things that you highlighted upon is collecting the data from the banks. And one comment you said is you can get like a 40-pager of the services that they can provide. And this poses a question. When you're requesting the data from the banks, as per your criteria and all of this, do you have a template, or do we usually use a template that we send to the banks to fill out, and we strictly abide them by this template to only use this, which makes our life easy? Or are we okay to receive their own templates with the answers of the criteria and the services that we need? So how do we manage
You can
that?
do either. You can do either. I mean, personally, for me, I prefer a more simplified approach. Okay, so I will typically put together a list of questions. I typically will use the same questions, which banks can use as almost a format to answer. They can easily put their responses within what I've provided them, or they can come up with a separate document if they feel that they want to explain some of their solutions in a bit more detail. So I'm not typically that rigid, because there could have been things that I've missed in my questions. It could have been things that the bank wants to tell me that I don't want to just restrict on. But again, it comes down to how involved your RFP is. If you're just doing an RFP for simple cash management, for example, okay, just payments and receipts, you could probably make it a little bit more rigid. But if you're looking at a full suite of services, I think it's often good to give the bank an opportunity to really sell themselves and really kind of let you know what solutions are out there. And I find, I've done, RFPs in the same country multiple times, throughout my career, and how the landscape can change between, doing it, say, 10 years ago to doing it a year ago, particularly in markets like Africa, where, you know, back in the day, a lot of manual payments, checks. Now you've got mobile money. Now we're looking at stable coin. All of these things are now coming through.
Yeah.
So actually answering the right questions and giving the banks the opportunity to say, by the way, this could be coming next year. These are important things to understand.
Awesome. So let's spend a couple of minutes going through the process step by step. Let's imagine that now we're starting an RFP. I will let you set the scale for how big it is. And okay, this is where we start engaging. This is the second step, step by step, and the expected timeline as per the scale that you're going to set.
Yeah,
But
okay.
just to give an idea for the audience, the flavor of how the process goes from start to finish.
Yeah, fine. Okay, so if I give an example where let's say we're doing a regional RFP, because typically, I've worked at organizations where we've had 60 or 70 countries to kind of do bank RFPs on. So typically I would look at it from a regional perspective. So I think my first point of call would be to do my own sort of internal checklist within Treasury around what I need, first and foremost. So again, I touched upon it earlier, but, listing the sort of bank strengths that I need. So digital capabilities, abilities to make the payments that I require, the collections that I require. I would look at things like bank ratings, size of the bank in the market. So I will effectively create myself a list of the banks that I want to invite. Okay, so if you've got a banking group of, say, 15 banks, you're not often going to invite all 15 because you know straight away there's going to be certain banks that don't have capabilities in the markets you're looking at. So I will effectively do a short list of the banks plus the high level solutions that I'm looking for. I will then start to engage the business, because ultimately, without the business's buy-in, the RFP isn't going to work extremely well. So, having that initial discussion with the local CFO, finance director, giving them a heads up. Sometimes the business likes the banks they're using, and that's always a challenge, right? Because banking groups can change. You can have banks leave your committed facilities, joining. They could have had a really historic relationship, but ultimately there can be a difficult conversation here where it's, I know you've been banking with them for 20 years, but they're no longer giving us balance sheets at the center. We need to replace. So there can be a difficult conversation there. It could be that they're unhappy with their current bank. So it's actually a really positive discussion around, I can't wait to get some better solutions in. But the next stage for me is understanding what the business needs. So, are they very heavy on, say, cash collections? Do they have a lot of trade requirements? Do they have cash volatility, mid-month, which means they need some short-term overdrafts? All of these aspects I would then start to ask the business. And typically, the CFO will then start to bring in other areas of the business. So maybe sales could be involved, marketing could be involved, all of these things that then come in. So effectively, you then come up with a longer list of sort of requirements that you then need from the bank. So that's my pre-work. I think as well, always having a discussion with your own boss, your CFO, around anything that potentially they need from the bank RFP. I've been in organisations where the treasurer has control over the banks that are being mandated, but there can be other aspects that you need to be aware of, right? There could be other businesses. If you're in a family-owned company, there could be other aspects that need to be
considerations,
considered. Exactly.
That they need specific banks to start
exactly.
with.
Absolutely. So it's always good to have that sort of strategic viewpoint around something that might be coming up where you may need to have a specialized bank in. So that's my starting point. I will then start to put together, I would say, for me, couple of pages of Word documents with some questions. Start getting the volume data either from an ERP or a TMS. If you don't have that, then going through bank statements just to get an idea of volumes, things like that could be done. And that will then give the starting point then for the banks to respond. So I've kind of done my pre-work. I'll typically give banks 2 or 3 weeks to respond to an RFP, and I will make sure that I've got time in my diary to answer any questions, because there's a lot of schools of thought around this. Some treasurers, some treasury departments will give a 30-40 page RFP document with absolutely everything that they need. Some will do it a little bit lighter. I think either way, having a discussion with the bank is always going to be there. If you're putting a lot of information in there, it's not going to bypass just having a discussion, because the bank wants to understand your requirements. Seeing it in text sometimes doesn't go the full way that you need. So always anticipate having a conversation with the bank. Be prepared to talk through what you need. And yeah, then you let the bank kind of get to work and ultimately gather their pricing, get a list of solutions together. Once you've got that information, give yourself a week to review, generally, because it's important that the banks have given that time to prepare something. It's important that you give yourself the time to fully absorb what they're saying. And this is very, very important, because at some point you're going to have to let a bank down. Okay, so if you're doing an RFP with 5 banks and you're operating, say, a 2-bank model where you're going to operate a primary and secondary, it means 2 banks are going to be relatively happy. 3 banks are going to be really disappointed. So actually putting that groundwork and really understanding the solutions, I will put together like a comparison where I'm comparing and scoring against each of the responses they come up with. It can be a bit subjective, but things like pricing, you can score. Capabilities, you can broadly look at and do a compare and contrast. And when you actually get to the decision, the banks that haven't made it, they're going to want some feedback, right? And it's important that from a relationship perspective, you're giving feedback around those things. So spending that time fully understanding,
and it maintains a good relationship with the banks that didn't even get the RFP, because the way you treat them and the way you do the program or the RFP, they respect it, so that when you do another RFP, they'll be more than happy to join again, even though they didn't get the first one.
Absolutely. And I think some banks they're kind of prepared for it. I think banks kind of know their strengths and weaknesses, right? So there'll be countries that some banks are absolutely hopeful they're going to win because they're really, really strong. There's others where they're kind of actually just participating for the relationship as well. So I think having that open and transparent relationship is important. So we're at the point now where we're reading through all of the submissions. There could be follow-up questions. So again, if there's aspects which aren't clear in the submission, I'll then spend some time, asking follow-up questions, getting some more detail. Typically, we allow the bank to present their solutions. Sometimes you want to have a look at their system. So have someone give you an overview of how their e-banking system works, how their trade platform works. And this is where you can involve other departments sometimes. This is where you could bring in HR from like a payroll services. You could bring in your trade team for the trade platform. So this is when you start bringing in certain stakeholders. Once you're comfortable, we've got all of the information and you feel that you can make a decision, it's then going back to the local business, typically with a recommendation. This is what I'm seeing as strengths and weaknesses. This is the pricing. And generally you need to come up with a decision. Yeah.
Treasury is changing fast. New risks, new regulations, and new opportunities. You need to keep up to speed. The ACT has been helping treasurers for almost 50 years through networking, events, and qualifications. So if you want to grow your skills and connections, join the community that will give you the voice and the chance to shape the future of Treasury. Visit treasurers.org now to learn more.
Now, the tricky question, which I know it's tricky because we had discussed this before. What's after an RFP?
Yeah.
How do I identify if this RFP was successful or not?
Yes, okay. So straight after an RFP, so once you've made your decision, this is where the real work starts, because this is actually when you've got to start implementing whatever you've decided to go with. Okay, so if you've got an existing bank, you're going to have a discussion with them. You then have to start bank account opening, setting up your facilities. Once they're open, you're then going to have to start communicating with customers around paying into new banks. You know, all of these things do take time. So I think we talked about timelines as well, right? So, you know, typically you've got to allow sort of, I would say 3 to 6 months after you've made your RFP decision to actually start the rollout, you know, moving customers over to the right areas. So that's really important. And that can often lead to a lot of hand holding in terms of, you know, managing the businesses, managing, you know, the fact that they need to change bank account details and invoices, for example. All of these things need to happen. And if you don't do that, then things can fall through the cracks. Also, there's things around monitoring the new bank. There's been countless cases where the pricing you've agreed hasn't necessarily been reflected.
Yeah.
And that can, it's very jurisdiction specific. It's probably a polite way of putting it, but you know, that needs to be monitored, because from a treasurer's perspective, there's no real point of going through this whole RFP if the savings aren't coming in or the solutions aren't coming in. So that monitoring and ensuring that the project is brought to kind of the end is very, very important. So that's kind of the immediate step, I would say, after it. How to assess whether it's gone well, this is a subjective thing. So you will never know if you've chosen one bank, whether the bank you didn't choose would have been better. I think the immediate things you can look at are things like P&L savings. So you can certainly see whether your banking fees have come down. That's a very quick way to kind of assess whether that's come in. From a service level perspective, that's again something that's quite subjective. So again, it comes down to having discussions with the business, the overall relationship. There will always be challenges potentially when you start off. They're understanding you, we're understanding them as a bank. So being close to the relationship, having, you know, calls with the banks to, you know, actually talk around what's being implemented, having someone on the implementation team to support you on the rollout is important, but then also ensuring that things are going right. So having a review, you know, sort of 6 months, a year after you've transitioned across is very, very important. So that one, in terms of assessing it, you're going to get a feeling, right? If the CFO's calling you saying, I don't like this bank, why have you chosen it for me? There's obviously something where you're going to have to interfere and try and bring in, you know, some better service levels, have a discussion with the bank.
And I guess if some of the deliverables that they have been promising to deliver, like for example, even on the trade side, if they're able to provide specific LCs or honor specific LCs, doing specific payments on time, having the availability to collect specific amounts from specific regions on time. For I have this in mind when I have something in mind when I'm speaking about this, specifically in countries like Nigeria, where not just Nigeria, but I remember also we had this in, if I'm not mistaken, Ghana, where you needed to have a bank who has good reach, right? More branches.
Yeah.
Because you have some specific customers that for them, the availability of the bank or the branch is really important. So assessing that, is the collection improving? Is the honoring of the LC or the issuing of LCs in some of the tricky countries is being on time, or is there a delay of issuing the documentary collection? I believe it's something.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So yeah, and that's almost like the other aspect, you know, kind of looking at the solutions that have been implemented. That can be trade, that can be, you know, other services that the bank's providing. And I think having a reflection point is always important, because you're effectively comparing what you've had to what you've got now. Sometimes you don't get it right. Sometimes it could be that, you know, you've selected the primary bank and it actually turns out, in hindsight, the secondary bank could be doing, you know, better things than the primary. So you've always got to be mindful that you may have to switch things up. You can't be so rigid that I've made this decision, I've got to absolutely go through it. You've got to be flexible.
A question just came up to my mind. Sorry, we didn't prepare it, but I have to ask it. some banks would provide really good pricing, and I think we have seen that together before.
Yeah.
They would provide really good pricing, and you would choose this bank based on the pricing. But there is another bank that might have not provided the best pricing, but you might know or not know that they are actually the best bank in the country, given coverage, giving the liquidity of FX, all of this. But for you, you wanted to be fair, so you chose the cheaper one. And then 1 year down the road, you realize you did a big mistake. How can we try to avoid that?
Yeah, so
or mitigate that?
for me, pricing is important, but it's not the most important.
But if you don't choose it, then the bank will say, "Oh, you're not being fair. We gave you the lowest price."
Yeah.
That's the tricky part.
Yeah, I think this is where the transparency in the conversation comes from. So, you know, I think when I've done RFPs in the past, I've not always gone with the cheapest bank. If I feel that they've got better capabilities, when it comes down to like digital capabilities, counterparty risk ratings, it all depends on what the gap is. And I think this is where the sort of scoring metric I do is very important, because you're assessing a number of different points and you're looking at the overall solution. So I think that if you're not looking just at pricing and the overall capabilities, you should hopefully make the right decision. There are sometimes it may not happen because there's been, you know, details, or it could be that a bank's overpromised. But I'd like to say they are in the minority. But I think it's always important that as a treasurer, a member of the treasury team, you can have that reflection, you can have that discussion and change it, right? It's not that you're committed to bringing that business pain for 3 or 5 years if something's not working. I think and this is why I think having these sort of meetings after the implementation's been done to reflect on the solutions is important.
Interesting.
So I would always look at that 100%.
Can we maybe go through some of the challenges that you might have faced during an RFP, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so I think some of the challenges, and I alluded to it earlier, where the business really doesn't want to move bank. And I've had that in a number of cases where there's been a really strong historical relationship with a certain bank. Typically, these are local banks where they could be providing other services, not just corporate services, but more private services, where employees are getting, you know, mortgages, credit cards, and things like this, which always needs to be brought into consideration. I would say these are challenges when you've really got a lot of pushback from the local business around changing. And you kind of have to be prepared for it, right? There's ultimately a group behind it, getting funding from the centre. Banks are expecting ancillary. So it's really just framing it in a way that they understand that, you know, there's a bigger picture when it comes to getting the banks in. Of course, there's always a middle ground. There are certain jurisdictions where a global bank and a global bank only may not work, right? You may need to have, you know, local bank present. So I've always tried to listen to the business where I can and provide the best of both. And where you are still using a local bank for kind of services, having that transparent discussion with, you know, one of your lending banks, and they will probably know, right? There's been instances where you have to use a local bank for government payments, for tax payments. It could be that there's certain capabilities on the ground that a global bank can't support. I'm looking at areas in like Latin America. You know, these are very common areas where, or Africa, where you've got, you know, the local bank requirements. But getting back to the point in terms of the challenges, that is a challenge where you've kind of got that. The other challenge as well, sometimes on the implementation, can be very, very difficult. So you can imagine if you've got a business with tens of thousands of customers, making that transition to a new bank, communicating to them you've changed. These are things that can typically take a lot of time. So again, it's very important that your reasons for moving, you know, satisfy everyone. Okay.
Yes.
If you're moving bank to save $10,000 or $20,000 a year, but you've got all of that unrest and all of that. It's probably not worth it, right? So it's kind of looking at the bigger picture. The solutions really need to outweigh the sort of hindrance to the business
At least it
sometimes.
makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess the next question is, I've done an RFP and hopefully successful, saving some money. When do I know I need to revisit it? Or how often do I need to revisit it? Or is just one-off, I have the right banks and that's it?
Yeah, the way I've operated is I've typically done RFPs every 4 years. It's some of it can be linked to your RCF maturity. Okay, so it could be that if your RCF is coming up for refinancing, every time it's refinanced, you can then look to do another RFP because you may have a new banking group. I know at the previous company we couldn't decide 3 or 5, so we kind of went with 4. But it's entirely up to you. I mean, ultimately, particularly at one of the larger corporates I worked at, where we had 60 or 70 countries where we had to do these. By the time you had finished doing your RFPs, 3 years would have meant that you're basically starting over again.
So by the time you finish, you need to start on
exactly, and you're just forever doing them, right? So you need to be sensible around it. I think 4 years is a sweet spot, honestly, because you can then be upfront and say to bank, right, you have got the business for the next 4 years. We are then going to then potentially, look at changing, or we just do price tensioning the next time. It all depends on how that bank fits in the market. But there's no right or wrong answer. I think it depends on bandwidth. It depends a bit on your business and how complex that is. Yeah, there's a number of ways of doing it, but certainly you wouldn't want to do it too frequently because it's just you wouldn't get possibly too many of the benefits.
Yeah, and the banks won't like it as well.
They won't like it.
You need to have some long-lasting relationship with the banks, and the banks, as they feel more secure with you, they will be more willing to give you more business, or not give you more business, but waive more of the fees, give you more leeway, because they know they are in this for the longer relationship.
And I don't think I don't think your local CFO is going to like you very much if you're doing it every year either.
Yeah.
You can imagine, just the work that goes into it. But that being said, although you can have, reviews, let's say every 3 to 5 years, there's nothing stopping you doing an ad hoc review if something's materially changed in the business. Like, I've had instances where a bank has decided to leave a country. Now, that can happen. And then suddenly you're doing an RFP on a bit more of an urgent basis because you're looking to replace a bank that's given you 3 months notice to leave. So you've got to be flexible. I don't like being so rigid, because I think what makes Treasury so great is that we're flexible, right? You've got the markets moving, you've got everything that you're having to manage risk. So being agile around these things is also important.
But in this situation, when a bank leaves you, do you start an RFP from scratch, or you go to the second best bank from the previous RFP if it wasn't that long ago, or do you just distribute the business to the other banks in the RFP?
You've got options. You've got options. I've done both, actually. So I had an instance where we had literally finalized an RFP, and then 9 months later, the bank that was selected has said they're leaving. And in that case, yes, we actually went to the second place bank. And it turns out they're actually very, very close in terms of capabilities. That actually just came down to pricing. On paper, they could both do exactly the same. I've had an instance where we hadn't done an RFP very recently. So actually we just went out and we just prioritized that as being the first one because we had a business requirement for it. So yeah, it's flexibility. It's kind of just being able to, call on the banks to kind of, give you this information. But of course, in the background, it's always really important to keep up with what the banks are doing. So you've seen recently, a lot of banks are expanding into new markets. So actually keeping an eye open, having those relationship discussions around their presence markets, where their capabilities are improving, is also important.
And their future plans as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it might include your business. You might be interested, okay, I'm going to maybe give a chance to this bank because I know they will be able to support me in the future in this and that.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's based on the relationship, it's on trust. Maybe they won't be able to give you something concrete on ground now, but given the relationship and the trust that you have with them, when they start providing a specific service that you will be looking for in this region or in this country, you know we would be the first to be offered this.
Yeah.
I think we are at the point where I want to know your final thoughts. Maybe a summary for now. I want to start the RFP. Give me your final thoughts, your
Yeah, I think so.
advice.
I would always advise people to be organized around it, okay? Because the more prep that you put in, the more that you kind of define your own objectives, your own business needs and wants, the better you're going to be able to request that from the bank. If you go into an RFP like, oh, I don't really know what I need, the bank isn't really going to be able to help. You've got to be able to sort of convey your needs and wants. So I think it's important to kind of have that initial, thought process around what you need. I think the other thing, and it applies to a lot of bigger projects that Treasury kind of look at, engage your stakeholders. Nobody wants to be suddenly in an RFP without any warning, or have a new bank without being prepared for that. So I think getting the stakeholders engaged, particularly the local team if you are changing banks, and as well as your sort of your other pillars of departments in head office, your legal, your tax teams, if you potentially need those, your IT teams. So lots of communication around the business. And I think transparency to your banks.
Yeah.
I mean,
Absolutely.
it's a relationship thing. I mean, I personally do RFPs for the relationship. I think it's all about fairness, because if I just say, well, I've heard you're in country X, here's the business, your other banks are going to be quite disappointed. So I think giving your banking group an opportunity to kind of, bid for business, I think is really important. And okay, they're not all going to be happy. I think we've established that, but I think just having a seat at the table is also important. And it kind of gives them, they're putting balance sheet into your business, right? So it helps them manage their internal stakeholders around that. So I think having that fairness, that transparency with the banks is very, very important as well.
Makes sense. Again, as usual and as always, Roshan, I've learned a lot from you today.
Great.
Thanks again for coming and joining us. And I'm sure we're going to have you again in season 3, inshallah.
Maybe. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, man. Thank you.